The first year we were on the homestead, in all there were only about 60 acres of grain to thresh. But the second year, everyone had some. When the threshing machine could get there, the farmers went together, supplying the stook teams. Any grain in the field was stacked and threshed during the winter. When we were threshing on a farmer's place, that farmer supplied the meals for the crew. Our machine was powered by 4 two-horse teams, and the straw had to be forked away by hand. Dad did the feeding, and I had a steady job as band cutter, as Dad liked my way of pushing the bundles to him. This day, we were stook threshing for a bachelor. He was considered a good cook and went all out to give us a good meal, including raisin pie for dessert. The small shack was not large enough for us to get into it to eat. Using a couple of sawhorses and some boards, he set a table up outside, bringing the food he had cooked out for us to eat. It was hot outside, but inside the shack was swarming with flies, though he had sticky fly paper and wet poison fly pads all over the place. He had a tasty meal of roast beef, potatoes, carrots, and boiled onions with lots of homemade bread and butter. Everything went fine. He brought on 4 double-crusted raisin pies. Everyone dug into them. Everything was going fine until one of the fellows, when taking his second piece off the pie plate with his fork, accidentally dropped it on the table and the top crust came off. He started to gather it up. His face went white and he grabbed his mouth. He jumped up from the table and ran to the back of the shack. The fellow next to him, curious to see what had caused the commotion, looked at the pie. They jumped up. Holding their mouths, they too ran for the back of the shack. It must have been slightly dark in the shack when he was making the pies, because he had not seen the swarm of flies that had landed on the sweet, juicy raisin filling while he was preparing the top crust and covered them up. I don't think I need to mention that the dinner finished right then. The crew was a little weak and had a slight pallor the rest of the afternoon until we got the field cleared and pulled away from there. It was a long time before I could eat raisin pie again. When the land was surveyed, the land was divided into sections and numbered from 1 to 36, which made up a township. The even numbers were for homesteading. The odd numbered was CPR land given as a grant for building the railway. Odd numbers, except 11 and 29, were set aside for school sections, and the Hudson Bay Company got in on the grant system too. They got section 23, if my memory serves me right. During the First World War, most of the CPR land was bought up and put under cultivation. But before that, cattle roamed at will, and the heavy grass, prairie wool, was cut for winter feed, and usually stacked and fenced in the field where it was cut. There were quite a few brush patches, so none of the fields of hay were very large, perhaps 5 to 10 acres. Others, of course, much larger. There was an unwritten law that became effective on July 28th. During the last week, before the 28th, settlers were out picking larger fields where the hay was good. Then, bright and early on the 28th day, they would get out and cut 2 swaths around the field. No one else could claim that field. Then it was on to another field. If he got there first, okay. But if someone else beat him to it, he had to cut around smaller patches until he figured he had enough to do for the winter. Doing it this way, naturally, the homesteader cut around the field closest to his own place first, so there was no arguing about it. But sometimes, when he needed more, he cut around fields further away. Then, sometimes, there was conflict of interest. I remember one such incident. This one field of about 150 acres was good hay, though there were several patches of scrub brush which could be cut through with the mowing machine, but didn't really make much difference to the hay. The land was fairly level, except for a slight depression, which carried the water away from the spring runoff, zigzag halfway across the field. Brush and low trees grew here too, thick to cut out or see through. The field did not border on anyone's land, so was free for cutting for anyone who wanted it and got there first. From where the heavy brush stopped, in the draw to the edge of the field, because of more moisture, the grass was long and heavy. The strip was about 50 yards wide of choice hay. Unknown or unsuspected, both Uncle Fred and Alec Allen had chosen this 150-acre field for their extra hay. Bright and early on the 28th, both were in the field and started their swaths. Each had started at the corner of the field closest to their own place. They would be better than half a mile apart when they started, so neither saw the other as they were traveling in opposite directions until they came to the draw with the trees. Then they were going in the same direction, one on each side. With the noise of the mowing machine, neither heard the other through the trees, although they were nearly opposite one another. They were both so interested in watching that the cutting bar did not hit a rock or a low stump that they were nearly thrown off the seat when both teams suddenly stopped facing each other. They were not the best of friends, as each one had pulled a slippery deal over the other, and they both knew it. Which one was going to get the choice hay piece, which was right beside them. Both would take some slick maneuvering to get it from the other. They made several attempts to prove which should get the patch, without success to prove. Then a hot argument started about the slick deals each had pulled. They were so engrossed in their argument that they did not notice that Jack Day had come through a break in the bush at the side of the field where the draw ended. As no one had cut a swath, and seeing Uncle Fred and Alec stopped at the other end, he took it for granted that they were not going to cut it, so he lowered his cutting bar and cut a swath along the edge down towards them. When he got to them, he could hear them yelling at one another. He didn't want to get in the argument, so he mowed right past them and up the other side, and was down to them with his second swath before they noticed what had happened. Jack did not stop until he had completed his 2 rounds, and the hay was his. Uncle Fred and Alec were big losers. They each only got a small stack of hay off the balance of the field, where they had been sensible, and forgot what had happened in the past, for which they were both guilty. They would have taken half the field, and each would have had 2 large stacks of hay for their efforts. As it worked out, they each had to go 2 miles further from home to get enough hay to make up for the loss. An Englishman, just over from England, rode up to the store one afternoon on a bicycle, looking for a homestead he could file on. I had never touched a bicycle before, and was curious to see how it worked. Noticing my interest, he told me to go for a ride on it. I stepped on one of the pedals and propelled myself, with the other foot going around the yard for a few times. Encouraged by Marshall and Earl to sit on the seat and use both pedals, I decided to try it. It looked easy to jump off of it. If anything went wrong, with the boys holding the bike up, after several strides, I got my other leg over the bar and both my feet on the pedals. Then they let go. I only went a couple of feet when I found myself on the ground with a skinned shin and the bike on top of me. I was for giving the whole thing up, but the boys dared me to ride it. The situation was bad. I didn't relish the idea, but a dare is a dare. And I was not about to turn down a dare for the first time. The bike was on top of me more times than me on top of the bike for the next few times I tried. I couldn't get going. The yard slanted down towards the pasture. I figured if I headed down the slope, I might make it and get the hang of how to stay on and make the thing keep going. I tried it and got going okay, but I couldn't steer it. There was a 3-strand barbed wire gate into the pasture at the bottom of the slope. Usually the gate was left open, but not today. The further I went down the slope, the faster I got going. Too fast to jump. I couldn't turn the darn thing. I knew nothing about brakes. All I could see was that gate coming towards me, and I could do nothing. When we hit, I sailed over the top wire, and the bike flopped up against the gate sideways, then fell over, not much worse for the spill. But me, I was thoroughly unprepared for the fall and landed with a thud. Besides, some of the barbs tore my shirt and pants, besides leaving some deep scratches on both my legs. I opened the gate, picked the bike up, and pushed it back up the slope. Trying it again did not appeal to me. But with the boys edging me on, I tried it. This time, with no gate to contend with, I got the hang of steering it, and also how to stop it. I kept at it until I learned the secrets and could ride it without falling off. By this time, I was so tired I didn't care much what went on. The chores done and the Englishman still there, Mother invited him in to supper. The amount of food he ate, we wondered if he had not had any food for the past week, or was he storing up for the week ahead? Mother had put on a large dish of strawberry jam for dessert, as she often did. There were few desserts we liked better. With the other things taking up the center of the table, she placed the jam dish near the Englishman's plate. After cleaning up his third plate of meat and vegetables, he wiped it clean with a piece of bread, then searched the table for dessert. Spying the jam dish, he put it on his plate and ate the whole dish full as if it was canned preserves. Mother got another dish for the rest of us. After the jam episode, Mother would not ask him to stay for the night, fearing that he would take 2 beds to sleep in. He left, and we never saw him again. Just as well. He wouldn't have got another invitation to put his legs under our table. It wouldn't have been so bad, but Mother only had a small supply of jam, as the wild strawberry crop was poor that year. I went through my first nightmare that night after the go-around with the bicycle. I was partly conscious of what was going on, but could not put it together until Mother told me what had happened the next morning. It seems I jumped out of bed and came downstairs on the dead run, stopping when I came to Mother's bed. I sat on the side of the bed with a head on my knees, saying nothing. She knew I was asleep. It was pitch dark. After a few minutes, I sat up and said, "I better try it again." Then off I went on the run. I fell back down 3 times before making it upstairs, and once getting into bed again. All the time running as fast as I could, even going up the stairs. I remember a little of going down the stairs, and once getting up from the bottom after I had fallen down. The worst part was that I was so tired I could hardly move at all the next day. I kinda liked riding a bicycle after that, though I never had one of my own. It was Christmas time. I was 9. We were in the sod house. Dad got a nice big spruce tree and set it up just outside our bedroom door. This was the sod bedroom Dad had built on after he finished the rest of the house. The scene comes readily to my mind. The reason it does, you will learn later. Us kids searched through all the magazines we could get hold of for colored paper. We cut the paper into strips. Then, using flour paste, we made long colored chains to go around the tree. And some for the walls. We threaded spruce cones for around and across the window. We made tiny candles and tied them to the end of the branches. Hidden from the others, each of us had made toys for the others, from spools, yarn, feathers, and pieces of wood. All were put on the tree. It made quite a colorful display. Dad had not arrived home when Mother told us to hang up our stockings and get to bed. After putting a plate of cookies and a glass of milk on the table for Santa Claus, we hung up our stockings on the backs of chairs and hurried to bed and to sleep. We knew that we would get no toys if Santa found us awake. We were awake early. It was still dark and the house was cold. I tiptoed into the kitchen and lit the lamp. Using the poker and keeping quiet as I could, I stirred the ashes down and put some wood on the last of the dying embers. Opening the draft as far as it would go, I tiptoed back to bed without waking Mother or Dad. The wood caught and the stove was soon red hot. I stole out into the room again to shut the draft. I reached for the poker. It was so hot, I dropped it on the cat's dish, breaking it in 1,000 pieces. That woke the folks. They jumped out of bed to see what the noise was all about. With them up, the other kids came running in too. Everybody up, we grabbed our stockings to see what Santa had given us. I can still see each stocking hanging on the chairs, each filled to overflowing. I wore long stockings those days. I had hung one of my stockings up for our baby, Maud, and pinned one of her tiny stockings to it so Santa would know it was for her. Sticking out the top was a porcelain doll. Irene was sure it was hers until she found her own stocking. In hers was a large sleeping doll with hair. I can't remember how many times I loosened the hair to pull the eyes back so they would work. Sticking out of Earl's was a red fire engine Dad had made. Out of Marshall's stocking was a furry monkey that climbed up and down when you pulled a string. All their stockings were filled with candy, peanuts, articles of clothing, an apple, and more toys. Mine? Sticking out the top was a wooden whistle I had made in the late fall. They had made me put it away because I blew it too much. Next was a pair of felt shoes. I had quite a time getting them out. An apple rolled up in a lot of paper, a pair of wool mitts, some peanuts and candy, no toys. I put my shoes and mitts on, and trying not to show my disappointment with no toys, I helped the other kids unwrap their things. Dad lit the candles while we sang Christmas songs and cleared off the presents on the tree. Mother made chocolate milk. We had cookies and apple tarts she had made while waiting for Dad Christmas Eve. I dressed and put on my new felt shoes to go and open the barn door so some of the steam would get out before we started the chores. When I came back in, Dad said, "Be careful with those shoes, or I won't buy you another pair." What did he mean? Santa Claus had given them to me. Uneasy, I got Mother aside and asked what Dad had meant. Then she told me who Santa Claus was. To say I was surprised would be putting it mildly. I had no inkling of the truth. She cautioned me not to tell the others. I didn't. They found out much later themselves. Something went out of Christmas for me there when I learned the truth. But as I grew up, I stayed and helped the folks with packing the presents around the tree. And then I became Santa Claus to my own children. All the things I thought I had lost, and much more, came back to make all my Christmas festivities so happy and unforgettable since that Christmas so long ago. It was on this same Christmas morning. Dad promised to stay inside while us boys did the chores. It was 30 below with no wind. Frost crystals painted a magic scene. You can tell kids not to do something over and over again, but that's not enough. They just have to try it themselves. So it was with Marshall. The fluffy crystals on the steel tire of the buggy wheels beside the path to the barn looked too good to pass by. He had to have a swallow. He opened his mouth wide to get a good lick. When his tongue touched it, it froze solid to the steel. He tried to get it loose, but he was stuck. No one heard him yelling. Luckily, I came out of the barn with a pail of milk and saw him. I ran for the house and got the tea kettle of hot water. Fearing the hot water would burn him, I poured it on each side of the wheel until it warmed the steel enough to loosen his tongue. Boy, did he ever have a frost burn. He could only eat soft porridge for the next 2 days. He missed all the lovely Christmas dinner. He learned the hard way. His tongue was sore for a long time. Dad was always a baby when he was sick or got hurt. I think it was because he liked the attention. And he got it 120% by all of us, especially by Mother. Mother kept a slop pail at the side of the kitchen steps for her dishwater and scraps from the kitchen. No matter how many times we fixed the fence, this one old sow managed to get out, tip the slop pail over, eat the scraps, and was gone before we could get to her. When we chased her, she would either go through a hole in the fence or jump it to get back in the pen. There was always a muddy mess around the steps. Father had hurt his knee while playing baseball. We made him a pair of crutches so he could work in the store. 2 weeks later, he was still hobbling around, unable to put any weight on his knee. He was sitting at the kitchen table doing some bookwork when he heard the old sow at the slop pail. Grabbing his crutches, he hobbled over and quietly opened the door. There was the sow with her head in the pail, trying to get the last of the scraps. Perfect. Using one of his crutches, he really gave her a smack on the rear end. Instead of backing out of the pail, she pushed her head further in. Too far to get it out again. She stood still. Father hit her another crack. She started to run, but unable to see, she bumped into everything that was in front of her. She bumped into the steps, which were not very solid, and Dad overbalanced and fell. That made him mad. He forgot to use his crutches to get around with, and instead used them to pound the old sow. He had the old sow where he wanted her, and would teach her to stay in her pen. Trying to head her for the pen, he hit her on the side. She turned and ran into the side of the house. He hit her on the other side, and she ran into the engine shed. No matter which way she went, she hit something and was getting further away from the pen with Dad after her. Finally, unable to get air in the pail and nearly smothered to death, she staggered to a stop up against the back steps to the store. It took a lot of tugging by Dad to pull her around far enough to get the pail off. With the pail off, she could breathe again and see where she was going. She got up and headed for the pen at a slow trot, with Dad right behind her, with his crutch beating a steady tattoo on her rear end. She managed to make it through the fence and into a muddy water hole in the pasture. Dad left her and went back to get his other crutch. He picked it up, looked at it a moment, then threw both of them over by the engine shed. Then he went back and fixed the hole in the fence. Mother was in the garden, and us boys were in the barn. We had seen it all, and we nearly busted to keep from laughing out loud for fear Dad would hear us. No one dared mention it when Dad came in the house and walked without even a limp into the store. Poor Dad. He was proud and couldn't stand having his pride hurt, which it would have been had we mentioned how quick his knee had healed. Dad had finished digging an outside cellar and covered it with a thick layer sod for the potatoes and garden vegetables that had grown so large and plentiful in the deep black soil during the summer of our first year on the homestead. Each day we dug, pulled, trimmed, and added to the steadily growing pile of vegetables in the cellar, hoping that we would have everything inside before the frost and snow arrived. With Mother's help and guidance, it looked like we would win. Then, in the early morning of September 17th, 1906, the stork visited our home and gave us a tiny 5-pound baby girl. We were all so pleased and happy to have a new baby with us. After a lot of arguing, we agreed the name Maud suited her. The midwife, Ms. Day, washed and tended the baby while we looked on. She was so frail and tiny, we were not allowed to touch her. The second day, Mother took sick with a high fever. Dad went for the doctor at Sedgwick, 26 miles away. Late that night, the doctor arrived. Aunt Winnie came and took the children, all but me, back home with her. Mother had blood poison. The doctor stayed with her for 2 days before he got control of the poisoning so he could leave her. Several times he thought she was going, but she rallied through. All this time, Dad and I stayed in the house to be close to her. The neighbors came and did the chores, and several women brought food. It was a tough time, and it took a lot out of Dad. It was a long time before Mother was able to do any work. It was during this spell, until Mother was able to take over, that I learned to make bread and do the cooking, as well as take care of the house. When a neighbor could sit with Mother, us kids, with Dad's help, when he was not working in the field, or for others, got the garden cleaned off and sorted in bins the day before it snowed. When Mother took a turn for the worse, her breast swelled and hardened. We did not have a breast pump. We had to put baby Maud on cow's milk. Dad or the others couldn't do it, so I had to knead her breasts and suck the milk out. I had to do this every morning and night until she dried up. It had to be done, and it did not bother me after the first couple of times. The worst part was her breasts were so sore. Though the feeding formula was changed several times, Maud remained very weak and did not gain weight. Mother being too weak to travel, Dad and I took Maud to the doctor in Sedgwick when she was 3 weeks old. There was no hospital. A kind lady, I can't remember her name, took us in. I stayed with the baby while Dad went back to look after Mother. After a week with the doctor, Checking twice a day, we went home. She looked better, ate better, and had gained a little, but her kidneys were not working properly. It seemed only certain water could be used with her feedings. We had to be very careful with her diet. She had to have fruit, fresh fruit, other than apples and the odd orange was not available. Any fruit we got was dried. Her frail little body kept her from taking part in the playful activity of the other children, which set her apart. She had to be quiet and spend much of her time alone. With Mother's weakness, much of her care was left to me. She made good use of it, depending on me for her amusement. She went to sleep in her own bed. In the morning, I woke up. There she was, cuddled up in my bed. We moved to Killam, where fresh fruit was easier to obtain, but the water remained a problem. Mother's brother had a small farm at Lake Megantic in New Hampshire, where there was an abundance of fresh fruit. After a test was made of the water from a spring on his farm, the doctor advised taking Maud back east. Just before I left for overseas, I got leave and took her to live with Uncle Morris. It was a lonely life for her, but from the very first, her condition improved until finally, just before I came back, she returned home with vitality to spare, but found it hard to establish real family relations, having been left out so long from the family group. Her and I have much in common from this absence, though in a different way. Her through sickness, and me being pushed into an early adulthood where childish things seemed silly and grown-up things became important. Mother's illness took a lot out of her. She was weak for a long time and could do very little around the house. It was during this time that our little family became very closely knit together. One of us, who was not busy at the time, stayed close beside her to keep her from any overexertion. Each of us had certain things to do, and willing hands from the others gave help when needed. There was no quarreling amongst us. We all knew, somehow, that if we did not get along together, it would hamper Mother's getting better. And we did so want her to get well. Mother had gone through a lot, and though she finally got well again, she never did gain back all she had lost. She never did gain back her old self. She never complained. We all knew that death had been very close, and something of what she had gone through, and how lucky we were to still have her with us. Ms. Day taught me how to bathe and take care of the baby. We tried our best to make sure she would have no complaints against us. The neighbors were good, and never a day went by but what someone came to call and bring something to keep our meal from being too dull. With all the housework, cooking, and chores to do, the daylight hours went fast, but it was the evenings that meant so much to me. With the other kids tucked into bed, I spent many hours sitting with Mother until she fell asleep. Sitting in Mother's rocker beside her bed, or if Dad was home, he in the rocker and me perched at the foot of the bed, we talked. Mostly about the past. I was young, not yet 9. Yet to them I was old enough to be taken into their confidences and told me many things about their younger lives, their families, conditions, and the things that had happened which had affected their lives. Mother told me about her childhood and her family, how her and Dad had met and started their life together. Sometimes Dad would sit with us and talk about his boyhood days and the funny things he did when he was growing up. About the home farm and how hard they had to work. Of the schemes to get a little pocket money to spend. How his brothers and sisters left home when they became of age because they got nothing for their hard work and there was no future for them staying on the farm. The broken promises by his mother and the arguments they had. He loved the farm and his father very much. He spoke low and with tears in his eyes when he talked about his leaving the home place and his father's advancing years. Growing old too soon from hard work. Dad told me of the dogma that prevailed among the religious groups and the enmity between the members of different churches. He carefully explained his father's philosophy of religion and how he lived his philosophy. He told me about his own feelings towards Christianity. He believed as his father did, but was a poor church-goer. Why we had come to live in a sod house, many, many miles from their old home and the people they had grown up with. I learned that had it not been for the ups and downs and the characters in their lives, I would have grown up in that tightly controlled life of an Easterner, instead of having the freedom to do as I pleased, which had been mine in the West. As I sat there listening to them, the years suddenly piled on my young shoulders. Before Mother was able to be up and around again, and our talks ended, I had gained invaluable knowledge, which, had it not been for Mother's sickness, I may have never known about. I promised myself that never would my children have to contend with the same attitudes in their family that my parents had had to put up with. I have kept that promise. I guess that trusting me with their minds long before our sitting beside Mother's bed made me conscious of it, and we could talk freely. I know from that time, on my part, in the family, and between Mother and Dad, took on far greater importance. Certainly for me, and I know for them too. In their eyes, I was already a man, sitting by Mother's sickbed, uncertain of her health in the future. The words of both Mother and Dad sunk in. Those nightly talks together took away my childhood innocence, gave me adult understanding, and I learned many things that prepared me for my future. You may wonder why I have written about things that happened before I was born. How do I know anything about what I have written? Well, in the first place, I have always been interested in my family history. I believe in many ways that background has had a bearing on my life. I've only written, as near as I can remember, what we talked about while I sat by Mother's sickbed. There was more, but so many years have passed, the rest has faded. In the second place, if you read what I have written, you will have the history of my life, much of which happened long before you were born. Not many children of today have had the chance to sit down and talk to their parents as I have. And how few know anything of their parents' heritage. I gained, oh, so much. Things of the past which have helped me through my life. Some of the many pitfalls we can stumble into if we are not forewarned. As you read my book, you will wonder perhaps why I have written about things. You will know. You were before my time, and what truth is in what I have written. It is true, and is either from my own experience or what I have been told, which I have no reason to doubt. That, before my time, has had a certain effect on my life in guiding me. I hope you too will find something of a guide to you.